he was a really nice guy. And he does not look like that nice guy anymore. I mean, the guy that I'm seeing on the news looks like a cold-blooded killer. The guy that I went to college with, that dude was nice.
I think he probably has an excellent ability to compartmentalize, meaning he can do something horrendous and think something horrendous and then box it over here, leave it over here, and then to the world, he appears as though he's just an innocent guy.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Surreal, numbing, shocking. That was the legacy the killer left following the quadruple murder that shocked the sleepy student community of Moscow, Idaho, out of its Sunday slumber. Howard Bloom, a journalist who spoke to the first responding officer, Shane Gunderson, described an eerie, unnatural silence at the scene that Sunday noon on November 13th. He describes the journey to 1122 King Road as a quick trip, that the roads leading into the university neighborhood were as empty as the classrooms. And as soon as Gunderson's black and white cruiser pulled up behind the neat row of cars parked in the driveway, he immediately knew something was very wrong. Just looking at the students and what wasn't going on with them, right? He said it was the noise, the fact that there wasn't any. The writer describes an eerie, unnatural silence that Gunderson experienced. He describes a cluster of young people, university students presumably, milling outside the open front door of 1122 like gulls on a beach. That they were exceptionally quiet. They weren't just subdued, they seemed stunned, drained by a deep and intense shock. Now, one presumes the writer of this article spoke directly to Gunderson in order to know that these three officers approached the front door and someone in the crowd would say a single word, dead. Now, it's hard to say how much of that is dramatic license, but what this is the transfer of the killer's psychological cloud, everything that he's been feeling, and it's transferred wholesale to them. It's his surreal, numb, eerie, bombed-out, silent headspace transferred to them, transferred to the community, transferred to the town. An essay published in the New York Times today asked rhetorically, was the Idaho murder suspect studying criminology to learn how to commit a crime? If I may be so bold to answer that, no. The suspect didn't sign up for criminology in order to commit a crime because that's what he wanted to do all along. In my opinion, that appears to have been a thought that may have occurred to him along the way. So how did that happen? Why? Well, here's a peek into that process, which, let's be clear, is a psychological devolution from disconnected to disaffected, from despair to allowing himself to be consumed by the clawing darkness. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I am an author of dozens of true crime books, and they are available on Amazon. I'll put a link to my author page in the description, so look out for that. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So, one of the ways that the first way that we came to understand Bryan was as a creep. One of the earlier reports, in fact, I think it was the earliest report, the first report that came through, just one day after his arrest, I think it was the 31st of December. It was this idea that Kohberger was an awkward creep who repelled girls. And that was true of Kohberger during high school, but that is also true of the modern, updated PhD version. We heard that he would have 2 or 3 beers and then just get a little too comfortable. When Bryan was confronted, he seemed shocked about, him getting too comfortable. And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. You have me totally confused. Except he didn't. He wasn't confused. Bryan did and does have 2 faces. This is one of them. And then there's another, the charmer. According to a recent article by Insider, I'll put a link to that in the description as well, Bryan could also be charming and chatty. According to the article, Kohberger was one of only a few students who kept appointments at the Pullman medical office after the crimes. That's according to what a receptionist told Insider. Just 4 days after the killings, presumably around the 17th or so, perhaps the 18th, Kohberger arrived at his appointment in his black North Face jacket, and he was so friendly with staff that people there took notice. So that is the other face of the suspect. It might be the face of hypocrisy. The receptionist at the office said that Kohberger acted so friendly it actually prompted her boss to comment about it. She said, wow, he's so nice and charming. And that's not something that she says about anybody. But the friendliness was a mask. Wasn't it the same smiling mask that Brian Laundrie wore during the Moab stop and Chris watched during the sermon on the porch? I mean, do we think that criminals are so basic that they aren't capable of showing a friendly face, of smiling, of being nice? So I think it's one thing to come across as friendly and charming to a receptionist on a slow day in a work setting. It's another for him to be seen that way in a casual social setting. Did his peers, did the folks at university see him as charming? Did his students see him as charming? Did girls that he approached see him as charming? Instead, it seems like he was perceived as an ordinary Joe. Now, according to the Insider, outside his apartment complex, Kohberger didn't really stand out. A bartender at a bar called The Land, a guy called Cassier Julius, that is the closest bar and restaurant to his apartment, told Insider that she'd have to crane her neck to make eye contact with Kohberger, right, when she served him. And she said she only remembered him because of his height and the last name on his credit card. She described him as normal. A server at a brewery in Pullman also remembered Kohberger, according to the Insider, of stopping in, but nothing stood out as particularly odd. And that was the problem. Even despite his height, he didn't stand out. Even if he was a little odd, no one really noticed him. Even if he'd lost so much weight and cleaned up his act, didn't really matter. So if he seemed normal and didn't seem odd, that was part of the problem. Because Bryan had come a long way in his personal journey. He'd overcome, as I say, a personal struggle. He'd cleaned himself up. He'd clawed his way up the ladders of academia, only to find himself still alone. And worse still, apparently not good enough. What did that feel like? Well, didn't it feel surreal, numbing, shocking even? And then there's Bryan the jerk, charming, an ordinary Joe, but also a jerk. It's interesting that the professors of criminology didn't really want to speak to Insider. You'd imagine professors of criminology would have something of substance to contribute, but no, they don't want to say anything. But there was a criminology student called Emily. She had Kohberger as a teacher's assistant. She said that she described Kohberger as being gruff and also difficult to deal with, and that was early in the semester. Now, irrational or unreasonable irritability and anger, these are classic symptoms of a neurotic, and that's along with moodiness. After the killings, according to the Insider, Kohberger seemed to lose interest in teaching. He assigned his students essays and he handed these back with uniform high grades. I think one way of looking at that was that it wasn't that he lost interest, but that he was perhaps totally distracted, totally fixated, totally obsessed with, compulsively looking at the news and finding out what is being said about the crime. I don't think it was that he lost interest, just that he felt that he had to focus 100%, that he didn't have time to do anything else except play this cat and mouse game. And also, bear in mind some of the things he did. He went to change the license plate of his vehicle, right? So that's where his focus was, and him not really paying attention to the teaching was, I think, because he was distracted. And then Emily said afterwards he didn't grade at all. She described him as not a great teaching assistant. But let me ask you, overall, do you sense a restless moodiness here in the way that others perceive him? And one of those perceptions is of him as a social animal, Bryan Kohberger as a social animal. We get this description also from Insider that he doesn't seem to fit the profile of a neurotic. Instead of being withdrawn and anxious, Bryan, on his home turf, around his apartment, seems to be actively reaching out, actively trying to make friends. He's even chatty. According to the Insider, Kohberger lived beneath Dash and his roommate in a boxy unit at Steptoe, a popular development, according to the article, that houses graduate students. Dash's roommate said that Kohberger gave him his phone number and repeatedly suggested that they socialize. And so the roommate said he talked to everybody. He was a very chatty person, not charming, but outgoing. He even asked me to hang out. Now think about that. So was he someone who socialized if he asked people to hang out with him? But is there any evidence that people did? It seems that they never did. It's one thing to be chatty, it's another to be so chatty that people eventually start avoiding you. That is what happened with Bryan. According to the article, one day the roommate suggested to Kohberger that they work out together because he thought that Kohberger seemed like a very fit person. So he said, well, do you want to come to the gym with me? But then Kohberger declined. He said he couldn't make it. Then Kohberger asked the roommate to grab coffee. But then this time he had a commitment. And so he continued striking up conversations, but nothing really came of them. Nothing really developed. There was no connection, no real connection that really developed. But sometimes in passing they would strike up conversations, and Kohberger would explain that he was from Pennsylvania and that he liked living in Eastern Washington, according to his neighbor. But what would complete the journey was having someone to share it with, being in this nice area, this affirming environment, and share it with someone. So the result of Kohberger's attempts to reach out and make friends seems to be that his underlying loneliness was gradually exposed. He talked, he was friendly, but he talked too much. And so this is the flip side of the story. Oh, so he's a social animal, except he's ostracized because he's trying to socialize. So they say that over time, this guy started to actually avoid Kohberger if he saw him coming. It's his own neighbor. And he said no, it wasn't because he didn't like him, but because their talks tended to drag on, because he spoke too much. And that is a symptom of loneliness. But I mean, imagine that you return from a unsatisfying lecture, or a lecture where you see a lot of kids, and you also want to be going somewhere and doing something with someone, only to have your own neighbors giving you a wide berth. In the aftermath to the pandemic, somehow Bryan is still experiencing social distancing. Imagine what that feels like. He said that when he saw Kohberger approach, he would quicken his step and appear to be in a hurry so that he wouldn't look awkward to giving Kohberger passing hello. That's according to the Insider. In other words, he wanted to avoid having conversations with him because he said, I know if I start, he won't stop. He just won't stop talking. And so overall, his assessment was that there was nothing suspicious about Kohberger, that he was a friendly guy and he would greet him in a nice way, and there was nothing suspicious ever. Well, it may not have been suspicious or weird for him to rebuff Kohberger. It may not have been a big deal. I don't really want to talk to you. I've got things I want to do. But then that guy's got other people to talk to. Does Kohberger. So actually, if you added up his neighbor avoiding him to all the other rebuffs and rejections, plus the whole backstory of that going back to high school, where high school girls would chase him away and throw things at him, eventually, with all of that free time on his hands and no one to spend it with, What else was there to do but sit in his Elantra and watch people enjoying themselves from a distance? And what kind of occurred to him at some point when he was doing this? I've come such a long way. I need to come to, where am I? Nowhere. I mean, at some point, didn't Kohberger basically give up in his attempts to socialize? Despite achieving respectability at home and with his parents, here he wasn't only average, but in a sense below average. There were a lot of people younger and more beautiful and more interesting than he was. That was his reality. According to the insider, Dash's roommate said that he presumed that, once his schedule cleared, that he would become friendlier with Kohberger. But instead, he became busier. And then he actually started taking steps to cut short his interactions with his neighbor. Think about that. His own neighbor takes steps to cut short the interactions, the minimal interactions he's having anyway. He decides he's going to make sure that it's even less. Meanwhile, didn't Bryan start taking steps as well to cut short the interactions of someone else? It makes you think Bryan is trying to engage and failing, and he's a criminology student, and isn't the best thing for him to talk about criminology, crimes? And although this sounds absurd, is it possible that, and I'm not saying this is the central psychology, but could it be part of what is going on, that Bryan may have been so low, perhaps so depressed at some occasion, that he imagined committing a crime somewhere else, so that when he was back home, he might end up being the go-to guy to talk about stuff like that. Anyway, that brings us to the whole idea of him being an outcast. What a place to finally be at. I think they describe the University of Idaho as the party central, the best place to party in college, in the state. And so he comes full circle after all that striving, all that work, right, to be back to being an outcast. They say those who knew the accused killer described him as an outcast whose transformation by his senior year of high school was so drastic they thought he was a new student. And that transformation continues until Bryan is 28 years old. It's a constant process of transformation. He's trying to change himself. But imagine, that is some transformation to be at school and to sort of be so changed in appearance that is unrecognizable. So unrecognizable that they thought he may be a new student. And so you've got to imagine Bryan's reinvention continued apace through college. And then after all that, the realization, outcast at school, but then he was fat and immature. Here he was a fit, clean-eating, clean-living college kid. And somehow he still didn't fit in. He was still persona non grata. And so wasn't this crime yet another attempt at reinventing himself? So the last thing I want to highlight from this really excellent article from Insider is a local actually describes it as a lonely town. You wouldn't think so, would you? He describes it as you have this experience in the town that it's friendly but not friends. That is typical of the communities of Pullman and Moscow. Tyler Engebretson, a 21-year-old native to Moscow, said that residents in both communities were familiar with many but friends with few. Well, that certainly wasn't the case with the kids in the funhouse. It seemed like they were genuine friends, especially Kaylee and Maddie, especially, obviously, Xana and Ethan. But can you imagine being in a situation like that, familiar with many but friends with few, and then watching these kids who have these genuine friendships with one another, just enjoying themselves? And that's what you want, but you can't get it. Somehow there just seems to be this culture of alienation, culture of we'll be friendly but not friends. So that cultural approach may have been anathema for a country boy who just wanted to be treated like a real boy. He wanted to be treated the way that he was treated at home in this setting. Hadn't he wanted that in his whole life? So Engebretson says that he was touched by the killings, but he said, if you want to know what this town's really like, it's a lonely town. It takes a lot of effort to meet people here. And isn't that what Bryan experienced? Isn't that what Bryan realized? Isn't that what he discovered? And so we've sort of gotten a few glimpses of another Bryan Kohberger. And the final glimpse I'm going to leave you with is with the less friendly Kohberger. And we know that is certainly part of how some people experienced him. According to his downstairs neighbor, they found that he wasn't particularly friendly. He was an insomniac who kept them awake at night by pacing and sometimes ran his garbage disposal until 4 a.m. And even though this bothered her, she didn't actually even talk to him because I guess she was hoping there'd be like a silent contract. You put up with my crying children, I'll put up with your noise. And so the article concludes with the words, outside his apartment complex, Kohberger didn't stand out to many. Well, until now. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.